Okay, good morning, Mr. Stockwell Day. Thank you very much for doing this again. I really appreciate your time.
Great to be with you, Trevor.
For the listener, we did the original recording for this conversation on Tuesday, but due to a technical glitch, I lost the files. So I really appreciate you doing this again.
Happy to do it. Probably the Russians intercepting our transmission there.
There's not many people at your end of the food chain that would do this again. So it really indicates there are clues sometimes on people who care about the message they put out there. So, uh, like I said, thank you.
Happy to do it.
For the listener, are a former federal cabinet minister, a pastor, you were a marathon runner, you were the leader of the Canadian Alliance Party, you were a board member, your family member, but how would you describe yourself nowadays?
Well, nowadays, I guess it's a continuation of all of those things that you just said. Since leaving politics, I've been running my own consulting business, and my wife works with me in that business, and then we hire contractors as needed. So I find myself working on projects that are business related, politically related. I speak to on areas of government. I speak to open audiences, university audiences. I speak in synagogues. I speak in churches. I even spent 3 days with the Dalai Lama in northern India with some other people giving him advice relative to China and Tibet. So lots of stuff going on, and probably most importantly, 15 grandkids and now one great grandchild that keep me moving and keep us both moving pretty rapidly.
And to go back to the beginning, originally you were born in Barrie, Ontario.
Yeah, lived in Ontario. I think I left there when I was about 11 months old or so. So I don't know that I left my mark in Barrie. My father at the time was just starting out in the corporate world, becoming upwardly mobile. He worked with a company that certainly listeners about my age will know, and some of your younger ones, but it was called Zellers, and it was opening up in Canada and spreading across the country. So as more stores would open, he being vice president, we would move to different provinces every time new stores opened. And that's really what got me to see a lot of the country, especially um, Ottawa, Montreal, Atlantic Canada. Those were the primary growing up spots for me.
I think you spent some time in Montreal too.
I did. Yeah, I went to school in Montreal. I lived there a couple of different times. For those who know the province and the Greater Island area, my family actually lived for a little bit of time up in Quebec City. I was pretty young, but then we lived in places like Westmount and NDG and St. Lambert. So got a pretty good flavor of metropolitan and even some urban Quebec because on my mother's side of the family, her mother and family grew up in Eastern Quebec.
And so where did you graduate from high school?
Well, it'd be Westmount High. Had a great time there, and then that was moving into the area of what's called the CEGEP. It was a whole new era in education. So I took the next year of education downtown at the High School of Montreal. So I got to be in what is looked at now as kind of the gritty part of downtown. Then before moving out to Western Canada.
And so after high school, what were you thinking at the time that you were going to move out west? How did you end up in Alberta?
Well, I wasn't thinking about it or planning to move out west. I can remember living in Montreal, our father announcing to us one day that we were leaving Quebec and we are going to go out to Western Canada. And I was shocked by that, as were my siblings. I was having a great time in Montreal. Expo 67 was going on. I had a job, I had a girlfriend, and we just thought life was perfect. And, I said to my father, Dad, why are we moving? This is great living here. And he said, I'm just tired of my bonuses, over 50% of my bonuses every year getting taxed away. He was working long hours as an executive. And that was sort of my first lesson. We didn't leave because of the so-called, the linguistic or the French issues of the time. We were fully engaged in Quebec life. It was the fact, and it was the first example for me, first life lesson, that tax policy has consequences. And we were part of that wave of people who were leaving the province of Quebec because taxation was out of control. And my father said, we're going to move to a province where they have no sales tax and where personal income tax is not brutal. You don't get punished for trying to get ahead. And that was an early life lesson for me. I guess that served me later as when I became eventually Minister of Finance in the province of Alberta.
And so when you graduated from high school, what were you thinking at the time that you might go into politics? I think you had a variety of jobs out of school.
Yeah, I did. I went to University of Victoria for a while, but as I tell people, I graduated from there before they saw fit to defer or to confer a degree on me. Traveled around a bit, took a gap year or two, did some things in Canada and the US and BC and Alberta. And really, what got me settled down was finding the love of my life. And we decided we would get married and start our own adventure. And that's what we did. Started out actually in British Columbia, working for the government, incidentally, in the Department of Highways in a brand new section called the computer section. That was new to a lot of people. After that, we started our own business, moved to the interior of British Columbia and did that for a while. And then opportunities opened up in Alberta, and we found ourselves with a young family in the province of Alberta.
For a while, you were working as a pastor, I think. What years were those?
Well, actually, what happened there in having a young family and looking around at the educational choices, we wanted more choice than what we saw the public school system offering. And we were looking around and seeing in jurisdictions in different places in the world that choice in education, charter schools, and that type of approach was leading to better choices and actually improved education because anytime you have competition in any system, even in education, it always leads to people seeing what they can do better and improve. So, in looking at that, we started looking and seeing what kind of choices are out there, and that was very limited in Alberta. Matter of fact, very limited in Canada at the time, and on that journey, we began to run into different people of different persuasions, people who wanted schools and more school choice, let's say for religious schools, Jewish people who wanted that, Muslim people, Christians wanted that. And so we saw the need to work with others and work with the government of Alberta to develop a whole new area of education that could be permitted for religiously oriented schools. Then we found there were people who wanted choice in education, had nothing to do with religion, but had to do with choices. They wanted kids maybe more of an emphasis on music programs or sport programs or business programs. Anyway, a couple of years of hard work with the government of Alberta at the time under Premier Lougheed, who was very open to this type of true freedom of choice and true diversity. We saw these programs develop and become legislated and permitted, and even funding following some of that. And it was in that process that a church group actually approached us and said, you know, we've noticed the work you've done with government in developing these areas of school choice. Would you like to work with within a church community and develop a church school? So we took that on and became administrators. We helped to found and become administrators of a Christian school. We did that for about 7 years. And that was really what was got our involvement in terms of church community. Sorry, by virtue of the fact I was administrator of the Christian school. In that school, I was doing a lot of work with the youth in there, and sort of becoming a youth pastor and an assistant to the senior pastor. So that's what got us into a very exciting time involved in advancing education and seeing true alternatives and true charter schools developing.
This was the '80s in Alberta. I think you were living in Red Deer at the time?
We're living just outside of Red Deer is where the school began that we started. And, you know, you'd mentioned as far as politics, it was one day during a provincial election when the local MLA came knocking at our door for our vote, quite understandably. And I appreciated him doing that. And I thanked him as he was standing on our doorstep for the fact that the provincial government, the conservative government in Alberta, under Premier Lougheed and then under Premier Getty had been very open to developing this new charter school movement. I was thanking him for that, and he said, "Yeah, well, I don't really agree with that. I think there should only be one system, the public school system." I was kind of shocked that he said that, and I said, "Well, your government's certainly been very open and very instructive and constructive in this area." And he said, "Yeah, I'm just saying I personally don't agree with it." And after he left the doorstep, I can remember saying to my wife, "You know what? Somebody's got to run against that guy." And I guess we could say the rest was history. That started our pursuit of an interest in electoral politics. And that's what started us down the road.
So rural Alberta is a long ways away from Montreal. At the time, were you thinking to yourself, I'm going to stay here? And were you comfortable? That it seemed from the outside looking in like two very different places to live.
Oh, you're quite right. Very different. I mean, urban Montreal and rural Alberta. A lot of people speculate. You see it in mainstream media a lot that there's these huge ideological differences between Albertans and Quebecers. And in some ways, yes. But, I started to find out politically that people in Alberta want a higher degree of autonomy, not necessarily separation. I know that's a hot topic these days, but more autonomy. And we found real common cause with people in Quebec. As a matter of fact, we also found a lot of people from Quebec are moving to Alberta. We had French kids in our school that started there. So there was really some common cause. Real differences, of course, in terms of rural living and in an agriculture community as opposed to urban, but some real points of common interest also.
And so in the late 80s, you thought that you'd run for an MLA seat in Alberta based on your experiences with the school system. But how would you have described yourself politically at the time? And how did your political opinions evolve from there?
Well, definitely small C conservative. We believed in things like, as the early lessons that I had learned, like people shouldn't be punished harder because they want to work harder, and people should have a say in government, and people should have a say over their own destiny. So, small C conservative, I was aligned pretty well with the Alberta Conservative Party of the day, and on most issues still today. So there was a high degree of comfort in terms of working within that kind of a context at the elected level. I found even going door to door and listening to what people wanted. Broadly speaking, there was a lot of agreement. You're never going to agree 100% with your elected person. You're never going to agree 100% if you're an elected person with all your constituents. But there are common causes where you can unite and actually for the common good and see the things that matter most being addressed in people's lives.
Did you have a political inspiration at the time?
There were a number of people I think I mean, it's a great question that inspired me even in my young reading when I was still going to, even early high school and elementary school. But, I guess inspired internationally by different figures, Winston Churchill, of course. And then I would do the reading also on people who would seem to be on the other side of the aisle. I remember, I think I was still in grade five, of was the first book I read about Lenin. And for your young viewers, I'm not talking about John Lennon, but Lenin, who was the follower and one of the first ones who put Marxist principles, communist Marxist principles into place. So I was fascinated by what motivated people, how they put into practice the things that they believed, and I would say there was a mix of, there are things about Sir John A. Macdonald, even at a young age, that inspired me. The fact that he actually thought this country could be joined together from sea to sea. Some of the, I would say, spiritually minded politicians of the time who actually were instrumental in getting things into our Constitution. The fact that the scripture verse on which Canada is founded, Psalm 72, verse 8, talks about uh, God's authority and the reach of God in people's lives and the respecting for that. I had a lot of disagreements with, and still do, with the senior Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the first of the Trudeau family to be prime ministers. But I did agree with what he did in terms of patriating the Constitution and in making sure in the preamble it said that we acknowledge the supremacy of God. Those are pretty brave, courageous things for a politician to be putting in place at the day. So through the days, different elected people have inspired me. People have taken a strong stand on issues. Brian Mulroney, certainly on his stand relative to apartheid. Yeah, different people motivated me, and I respected them for being willing sometimes to stand against the wave, and but to do what they thought was right and to do what they thought would most benefit their constituents.
This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This episode is brought to you by Bunch Projects. Bunch is a construction led engineering and EPC partner supporting Western Canada's energy industry for more than 45 years. Bunch combines practical field-driven engineering with data-driven planning to improve predictability and support cost certainty. From well pads and compressor stations to gas plants and energy development, Bunch focuses on construction, clear communication, and consistent results. Bunch construction-led engineering is built on trusted partnerships and proven performance. Learn more at bunch.ca. You were an MLA in Alberta through the late 80s and early 90s, but in 1992, I think, is when you met Premier Ralph Klein and is when the time he added you to the cabinet. I think you met him at the Calgary Olympics in 1988. But how did you meet Ralph Klein? And do you remember that day?
Well, first time I met Ralph, it was around the Olympics. I was just kind of newly elected, and so we were invited, the MLAs, because we were funding a good part of the Olympic. We were invited down there, and yeah, I'd heard a lot about Ralph Klein, and I can remember the first meeting with him. Just I was sort of taken aback just by what a down to earth guy he was. He didn't seem to be swept up or running around panicking about what media was saying about this and that. Matter of fact, he was getting into trouble in those days for some of his reflections on Eastern Canada and how if they don't want their oil and gas, well, maybe they should, suffer in the dark and freeze. So there was a lot of things that about him that were attractive in terms of he didn't seem to be terrified about what mainstream media was going to be saying about him. And so when Don Getty stepped down as premier and our leadership race started, I actually wound up supporting a local candidate for leader, and he ran a good race. John Oldring was his name, a great guy, but he didn't win. Ralph won, and I thought, well, that's it for me. You know, usually in politics, when you don't support the horse that won the race, you wind up on the sidelines. But Ralph reached out to me and asked me to be his Minister of Labor, and it was a phenomenal time working for a premier who said, you know what, we're going to do what we promised, and if the media beats us up, so be it. Those are exciting days.
So, how did you literally meet Ralph? Was it at a hockey game in the Olympics? Was that a meeting, or what was that day like?
No, it was. I mean, he was at the hockey games, but it was at a pre-Olympic meeting, and he was surrounded by people, and it was just a handshake and how are you doing? And then, of course, he eventually ran, and a lot of us thought, well, now that's going to be interesting. So when he won his nomination and he got elected. His first position actually was Minister of the Environment that Don Getty gave him. And I can remember I was party whip at the time, so it was my job to do, to make sure members were there for the votes. We didn't lose votes in the legislature. And Ralph, let's just say, in those days, was not in love with early morning meetings. Let's just put it that way. And when he would be late, it would be my job to phone around, find out where he was, maybe wake him up, try and get him to the meeting. And I can remember making a call early on to his assistant, a young guy at the time by the name of Rod Love. And I said, Rod, we're looking for Ralph. He's missing these early morning meetings. And Rod said, I don't know if I can help much with that. And he just said, Ralph doesn't do early mornings. And that was sort of, after I'd met him just personally at the Olympics, then getting them to meet him on that basis. But, he was great guy. He told it like he was. Got a lot of people concerned at the time, some of the ultra extremists on the environmental side. But that was sort of engaging first with Ralph was kind of making sure he got to the meetings. And that was kind of our first relationship. And it developed well from there.
From the outside looking in, it would seem that you two didn't have that much in common, but you worked well together through the years. What do you think brought you two together?
We worked really well together. We hit it off right from the start. Yeah, we might have had some worldview differences, but his respect for what we would call the common person, his dislike of too much bureaucracy and too much taxation, that really resonated with me. We both agreed that hardworking men and women shouldn't get punished harder just because they work harder or because they get more educated. So we really linked arms on those issues. And then, when he was running for premier, when he became premier, he said he was going to. Our goal, we got elected on the goal of was stated by him within our first term, we said we're going to reduce government spending by 20%, the size of government. Well, that's unheard of these days. It was unheard of then. But we probably wouldn't have got elected if we hadn't, really put a stamp on being fiscal conservatives. And I can remember one of our first cabinet meetings. We all had our cabinet assignments, and we had to come back, and that was under the guidance of Jim Dinning at the time was finance minister, a great finance minister. And we looked at the fact that there's no way we're reducing healthcare by 20%. That was going to be impossible, and none of us wanted to do it anyway. So that meant some departments were going to get a higher reduction in their spending than others. I remember as Minister of Labor, the reduction that came down to us was a 43% reduction in our department. And anyway, we brought in our plans. We went around the table for a few hours, and then Ralph looked at us at the end of the meeting. He said, um, if we do this, if we're successful, and in 4 years we've reduced the size of government by 20%, we may at that time be so unpopular that we won't get reelected. He actually said that. And we all looked at each other, and we looked back at him, and he said, but you know what? We promised we're going to do it. So if everybody's on side, let's get it done. And if we don't get reelected, we don't get reelected. It was an exhilarating moment for me in all my years in politics. It was one of the few times, and I've served under some great leaders, but one of the few times where we said, you know what? We said we're going to do something. And even if it means the media comes completely unglued on us and we don't get reelected, we're going to do what we said we're going to do. And as you know from the history, we did it. We reduced the size of government by 20%. And when we went into that election, the surprise election billboards that went up at midnight before the election all around the province was just a picture of Ralph. He was standing there with his sleeves rolled up, and all the billboard said was he kept his word. That was it. Um, yeah, so that was an exhilarating time. And that was, Ralph said at the end of that 4 years, he said, he used to say, my day wouldn't have been complete if I hadn't had a protest, because we had protests every day, everywhere we went. And the people looked at what we'd done at the end of the 4 years and they reelected us. So exhilarating time. And then going into the next 4 years, also being allowed to do some really brash things at the time, but things that worked out pretty successfully for the people.
Like a misbehaving teenager and parenting, the best decisions are the most unpopular ones. Do you think that the decisions you made in those days, while sometimes unpopular, were the keys to Ralph and your success ultimately?
Yeah, honestly, we wouldn't have done it unless we really felt, first of all, it had to be in line with what we'd promised. I don't like this notion where politicians, they get elected on one thing and then they get in there and they do a bunch of stuff you never even thought about or dreamt about. So we were very clear we were going to do these things. And then we were convinced the lives of people, the levels of prosperity, the levels of opportunity, even for people in need, that their cares would be met. We were convinced, and there was a lot of soul searching. I can remember walking through crowds of protesters. I remember one day, because we got out of the business of selling alcohol. Ralph said, "What is the government doing in the business of selling booze? Let the private sector do that." And we announced we were going to be closing down the liquor stores. I can remember, but also giving opportunity for liquor store employees to form their own businesses and become some of the ones who started their own, liquor stores. But I can remember. A woman coming right up to me, holding up the placard and saying, Mr. Day, I have two young children, and you're closing down this entire division, and I'm a single mom, and I'm going to be out of work. And, I got home that night, sort of looked in the mirror, and I said, do I really believe that this is, even for her, even for the future of her kids, is this going to be what's best? Is this going to work out for her? And I resolved, I said, yes, it is. So even when you're making the tough decisions, if they're based on what you think is best and based on what you promised people, then you keep going forward with them, and you don't get swayed by the culturally Marxist media, who will always try and turn people against you.
And a few of the main ideas that you and Ralph together, and I guess the party were paying down the Alberta debt and keeping taxes flat and or low. But where did those ideas come from originally? Did you study past leaders? Where do you think Ralph and you where did those ideas bubble up from?
Well, for sure, we were both convinced that, and I think there were enough studies, and we probably read some of the same things, that when governments spend increased spending with borrowed money, that's the single greatest cause of inflation. I know we like to blame small business, or we like to blame egg producers, or we like to blame bread makers or grocers, whatever it might be. The single greatest cause of inflation, that means your buying dollar is losing less power, is government spending borrowed dollars. And we were all convinced of that. I was convinced of that. Ralph was. Our first finance minister under Ralph, Jim Dinning, was convinced of that. So we knew we had to get rid of the debt. We looked at, it's just like at home. If you borrow money, you have to pay the interest to the banker. And we were looking at the interest payments we were making just on the borrowed money, and the interest payments we were making at the time were larger than what we're spending on entire government departments. People don't realize that money that could be going to really helping people is going to the bankers and going to the bondholders. So we were really fixed on that, and it was a promise of Ralph's. So we're going to balance the budget, and once we balance it, we're not going back into debt. We even legislated some of those things, so that it would be you would have to actually change the law to go back into the areas of wild spending. And yeah, we all believed heart and soul that that was the way to go, and that was the lead to see a return to eventual prosperity and thriving for all Albertans.
At the time, what was your thoughts on the Alberta Heritage Fund? Did you believe that we should set aside money for a rainy day and that the fund had potential to grow into something massive? But did you view it as a priority as well?
Yeah, we wanted to keep that priority. We never said when we ran for office, some were saying get rid of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. We never said we were going to get rid of it, and it was used to people can dispute the various projects that it was used for, but it showed that we were willing to take some of the savings that we're making from tough decisions and make sure that they were there for. It was called a rainy day fund at the time. So there was some pretty good debate on it, but if we were to have excess taxes, what one of the things that we brought forward, and one of the things I talked to Ralph about was, if we are having surpluses, that might mean we're taxing people too high. If we've got surpluses, certainly surplus should be built on the fact that entrepreneurs and small businesses thriving. But that brought us then to looking at the whole area of what can we do about the taxation levels themselves? Are we taxing people too highly? And Ralph was all for looking at that.
There's structural differences between Alberta and Norway, but the comparison is made between the two sometimes. And the sovereign wealth fund they have in our savings fund that doesn't seem to be as big through the years. Do you think that Alberta could have managed the fund better and we could have had more money at the end of the day, or do you think we've done the best we could?
Well, great question. And Norway is a great example because a lot of people say socialism works. Just look at Norway. That is not a good comparison if you're trying to make an argument for socialism, because or Norway, a huge part of its economy, quite rightly, was built on what you just said, built on the taxes that came from the oil and gas industry in the North Sea, and the fact that they were able to help millions of people and even other countries develop inexpensive energy products. And so what Norway did, because of the fact, at the time, I think it was 5 or 6 million people and a huge, huge fund there from their oil and gas. And so then they were able to take, after being successful capitalists, you can actually honestly say that, and successful in business, then they were able to take some of those monies and provide some really generous social programs, not from taxing people to death, but from the excess that was coming in and the surplus that was being made from the business community.
You think that Alberta could have had a lot more money at the end of the day if we'd prioritized it? This episode is brought to you by Bedell Gas Compression. Proud to be recognized as an industry leader, Bedell Gas Compression specializes in reliable, custom engineered natural gas compression solutions that support efficient operations. Backed by experienced field service and an unwavering commitment to safety and performance, Bedell is a trusted partner in the field. From flexible rental options to fully customized new builds, the Bedell team focuses on operational efficiency, safety, and long term performance, helping producers keep gas moving where it matters most. Learn more at Bedell.com. This episode is brought to you by Ambient. Ambient helps energy leaders improve production performance and expand margins through AI powered optimization. Built on trust, transparency, and collaboration, the Ambient platform turns data into confident decisions, delivering measurable operational impact. Find out how Ambient expands the capacity of your production teams at Ambient.com.
Well, there was a process in place. And again, that can be argued. Should we have built this? Should that have been spent? And there was always hot debate going on that. So I think it's always fair to have a look. And I think on a regular basis, and this was something we did pool together, working groups, roundtables of people to have an independent look at it. I can remember putting one of those together myself to look at spending and to look at the whole notion of the Alberta Treasury branches. Should we we were talking about getting the government out of business. Should we be in the business of banking? And we put together a group of people. And I can remember that at the end of the day, after we finished that investigation, the person that I had chairing that was a guy by the name of Jack Donald, who's actually out of Red Deer, and he ran some very successful businesses. He's passed on now. But I remember him saying to me, and he had started out as a small business guy with his wife and become very successful and helped many people. I remember him saying to me, generally I would agree that we shouldn't be in the business of doing business. He said, but we should never forget that through the 30s and through the 40s, when Alberta was really on the ropes and actually sinking because of the Depression, we got no help, virtually no help from Ottawa. We got no help we tried to develop some financial systems just for Albertans, and the banks shut us down. The banks shut us out. And so he said, we deal well with the banks now, with the national banks, but we should always have this little lever of protection, Alberta Treasury branches, just to remind the big banks, the big institutions, the big government in Ottawa that we have some means of our own, and we can tough it out if we have to. So yeah, it's always good to do those analyses. Could spending have been better? Could have been directed differently? In some areas, yes. And in some areas, we were getting it right.
Yeah, speaking of the ATB, they've been a big supporter of this podcast. So have to give them a quick shout out and thanks to their support. So they are supporting Alberta businesses, including the podcast. So
Well, it's good to know, and I always appreciated working with ATB. They still run. People think that they, give money on. They weren't tough on principles, but yeah, they were very tough. You had to show you had a viable business,
yeah.
but you were going to be Alberta based, and they weren't going to be as quick to slam the door on you and shut things down and crush you as some of the big banks had somewhat of a history of doing.
So the summer of 2012, Alberta was declared debt-free roughly. Do you think that the policies you and Ralph set up were instrumental in that event happening?
I really do. I don't think it wouldn't have happened without Ralph had his own ideas, and plus he also had said to us, if you women have some ideas, let's bring them in. And so there were a number of ministers who came out with some great ideas. I remember Mike Cardinal, First Nations guy, Aboriginal guy, and he said, "You know what? We're just throwing away too much money on our social services. There's people who really need money and really need help, but we're not applying enough scrutiny to it." And he started developing some policies, which I continued when I was social services minister, of saying to people, if you're healthy, if you're able-bodied, we're going to give you a choice. We'll help you with your education and we'll help you find a job, but there's no more passive welfare just for sitting around. And that shocked a lot of people, but it really ushered in a whole new era of social policy. We wound up moving a lot of people off of social welfare rules. But in the process of doing that, we were able to increase the benefits to those who truly needed help, but move off the ones who need to get a little bit of a push. We did the same on taxation policy. Ralph let me go ahead with asking the people of Alberta to consider a single rate tax that's sometimes called a flat tax. And the first thing we did there was we raised the amount of money a low income person could make before they even had to be taxed. We were taxing, people working at minimum wage. We were taxing low income families. And Ralph did not feel good about that. He said, "Why are we taxing low income families? They're just trying to get a start." But then we brought in a single rate and we said, we're just not going to punish people because they want to work harder. I learned that at an early age working in a packing plant, actually. And when the foreman would come down the line asking who wanted to work an extra 2 hour shift or 4 hours, a lot of the guys and the women would say, no, I don't want to work extra because they get moved into a higher tax bracket. And I saw early on that higher taxes, a progressive tax system, is a disincentive. It always punishes people who want to work harder, want to get more educated, want to improve themselves. So Ralph agreed, yeah, let's, if we can convince the people of Alberta to do it. And so we brought in a single rate tax, so called flat tax. We started it at 11% and it later moved down to 10%. Studies have shown that in the 14 or 15 years that it was in place before the socialist NDP provincially removed it, that it showed some real gains relative to productivity and relative to taxation. So those are the kind of ideas that Ralph was open to. And he said, if we can convince people of it and then we run the program and it works, let's keep doing it.
And so the idea was to get taxes down or keep it flat and pay the debt down to zero. But how far did you think about those ideas going? Did you think about if Ralph had stayed in power, that taxes would keep going down? Did you think to yourself that we needed a flat tax? Did you think to yourself that we could run some debt? Were there hard targets? How did you think about those metrics?
Yeah, great question. Well, we set it at 11%, the flat tax. We found early on that there was still going to be a surplus at 11%. So eventually, it became 10%. And we actually, Ralph's approach was always no limits. You know, let's think, as we say, it's one thing to think outside the box. It's another thing to try and think inside the box
Yeah.
and be creative on that. So Ralph would say, you got a program, do you think it's going to work? Let's run it. If it works, then let's keep it going. If it doesn't work, let's be brave enough to say, you know what, folks, we made a mistake. We're going to junk that program. I can remember in the Department of Labor, we put in a process that never had been done before, and that was awarding public servants for innovative ideas and programs. And this was far more than just a suggestion box. This was saying to all the people who work in the Department of Labor, if you identify a program that we can deliver with more efficiency and save money, and it doesn't mean I don't want you coming forward with here's how to get rid of this program, just fire Bob. No, we will make decisions on the size of the civil service. But if you can run a program for 6 months and save money, but still deliver the program, just do it more efficiently, then what we said was your department will get back some of the savings, not all. You'll get back some of the savings. And you, as the people within the department who run the program, you'll get a cash reward at the end of the year. I can remember we ran that program and people had to identify what they were going to do, what was the saving they were going to make, how they were going to do it. They'd present it to their supervisor. The supervisor would bring it up the line for approval. They'd run it for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, or the end of the fiscal year, if it showed they saved money, they would actually get some of the benefits of that. And I can remember civil servants, we had a big annual general meeting and civil servants being called up on the stage who'd run a program and actually getting a check to them personally. They felt really good about, proud about what they'd done. Some of the money would go back to the department. Of course, some would go to general revenue. I found out that the union leaders themselves didn't really like that type of program, but the rank and file loved it. And it was those type of, again, innovative things that we would say, if we can make the case for it, if people agree to it, we're going to bring it, we'll run it. If it works, we'll keep doing it.
So the critic would say through the 90s and even the early 2000s that paying down debt, lowering taxes, and Ralph Bucks were great, but it was in part due to the last commodity boom. But do you think that those policies actually attracted business and allowed the province to ride the waves, so to speak, regardless of commodity prices, and it helped set the backdrop for a strong economy regardless?
Yeah, that's a key observation you made just there because a lot of people say, oh, well, Alberta, they got oil and they can do that type of thing. No, if you, and I know you would recall in the history show, man, we were getting oil prices down around $14 a barrel. We were in tough shape. I can remember when I left provincial politics and went federal, I can remember saying to Ralph, I think we predicated the budget that year at about around the $20 mark, $20 a barrel. Even when you upgrade now for inflation, to today's dollars, that's not a lot. I remember saying, Ralph, if oil ever hits $24 a barrel, we're going to be in clover. And so we did a lot of this stuff on oil prices that were not stratospheric, as a matter of fact. And because our goal was to bring in other business, to bring in other industry, and not have to rely forever on oil and gas. One of the things we did, Trevor, was interesting when we were talking about the influence of the flat tax. There was a hockey player at the time, and it was commonly known that he was deciding whether he was going to be being given an offer with the Montreal Canadiens or with the Calgary Flames. We just ran the numbers on what would be the difference in terms of cash in his pocket if he came and played in Alberta, where there was a flat tax, as opposed to Quebec, which had a hugely progressive tax. And it was much more beneficial for him to come play for the Flames. So, we used actual real life examples that actually you come, you bring your business idea, and you make money. We are not going to punish you for taking risk. We're not going to punish you for making more money. I can remember standing in the legislature when the critics used to go after us on that particular proposal. And I used as a real life example, a doctor friend of mine. And when the NDP were going after me one day in the House about our flat tax, I said, I have this friend. She's a specialist, and she delivers babies for a living, among other things. And I said, she makes, at that time, it was about 250,000 a year, which was a pretty good salary. I say, she makes 250,000 a year. She's gone to school for over half of her life at that point. And I said, between Paul Martin, who was the federal minister at the time, and myself, we take about $90,000 a year from that woman who gets up in the middle of the night to do her job in emergency wards. And I looked right at the leader of the NDP and I said, "How much more do you want me to punish her for being hardworking and getting educated?" And that kind of silences people when you put it in that context. But that's what we really felt and we really knew, and it was proven out. People will be excited about working and excited about not being taxed to death, and will work harder if they know they're not going to be punished for it. That was the underlying premise of what we did in that regard.
And it's one thing to come up with policies in closed door meetings in the cabinet and in Edmonton, but it's a whole nother thing to take feedback from the business community. Do you remember a time when you were commended by the community for taking these steps and having the courage to implement them?
We got a lot of support. I will say that from the business community. The business community generally liked this approach, but not just from that community. I can remember when we moved to letting outside services do government work. We said there's virtually nothing that the private sector can't do if you put in the right regulations and put in the right guidelines and monitor it carefully. Some of the things that government does could be done very efficiently in the private sector if you monitor it correctly. And so the Albertans will remember we used, for instance, motor vehicles branch, the driver's license. Anybody in those days who wanted a driver's license, as still in most provinces and even in the United States, you stand in long lineups to get your driver's not licenses, your motor vehicle stuff done. And we put in all the safeguards in place and said, you know what, we're going to see, we're going to let the private sector step up. Private sector is very advanced technologically. And we moved to an entire registry system where the private sector could deliver those goods. That exists in Alberta to this day. I can remember one of the complaints we used to get from people wanting to get their homes built was the length of time that it would take inspections to happen. You'd get so far, and then you have to have the plumbing inspection, quite rightly, and the heating and the wiring. And having government do it was a very slow process. Nothing against the people doing it, but we like to say, and we say now, it's a matter of good people, but being trapped in bad systems. And so we contracted out the entire registry and inspection system. I can remember when we looked at contracting out laundry services in hospitals, like there was a taboo if there ever was one. Anything in the healthcare sector, you can't see if the private sector can be done. But when we did that, one of the hospitals in Calgary, they contracted out their laundry services. They felt it could be done as long as you put the regulations in place at just as high a level and at a way that would save tons of cost, money that could go into true healthcare rather than just, diaper cleaning. And I got a call from a union leader one day in Calgary, and he said, "You know, Minister, I represent a group of union leaders, and the hospital here is contracting out the laundry services, but we've put together our own company, but they're not going to let us bid on that because we're existing workers." And I met with the administration of that hospital and say, "Hey, listen, you've got a group of laundry workers. They want to form their own little company. They've been doing the laundry service in the hospital. They might know some things that others don't know, so they have to be given a fair chance to bid also." And they were given a chance to bid. Matter of fact, we wound up winning that particular contract. So we got a lot of praise from, again, rank and file, not necessarily the union, but it wasn't just the businesses. It was also people who were thinking about getting ahead themselves and actually being able to develop products and services that were pretty amazing. So we received backup and support right across the board from the labor side and the business side, not 100%, but a lot more than people would have thought.
This podcast episode is brought to you by JSG Professional Services, Canada's leader in pipeline construction management and inspection resources. JSG provides competent, qualified, and verified pipeline construction management and inspection resources, supporting Canada's largest pipeline companies from initial development through final execution. Whether your project involves new pipeline construction, integrity programs, maintenance pump stations, compressor stations, or inline inspections, JSG has consistently delivered experienced professionals to Canada's energy industry. Visit gsginc.com to learn more. Things are pretty good in Alberta nowadays and generally in Canada, but at the time when you and Ralph were setting up those systems with low debt and taxes were flat, and as the debt was heading towards zero in '04, could you feel the tailwinds behind you even then when things were going well and that your ideas were working?
Well, we knew that they were working, but we were running into headwinds on a number of different areas. For instance, right at that time, the government of Alberta, of Ontario, the provincial government, was headed by the name guy by the name of Bob Ray, who we all know today. He's a nice guy, and I consider him a friend. But he was NDP, he's socialist, and his policies. It was actually good for us in a way because we were able to say, look what socialism is doing in Ontario. It had never been tried before. It was completely destroying the economy of the province. Matter of fact, Ontario was running into such high debt that their debt requirements were actually affecting the national debt because of the levels of borrowing. And so we were able to bounce off of that. And then after he was and the socialists were thrown out of office in Ontario, and I hope for good, but we'll see. Then I can remember under Mike Harris, the premier of the day, he actually sent his people out to Alberta to see how we had done some of these things. And they took the things they thought would work for them, not everything we did, but they took some of those things and they were able to see improvements in Ontario, which is really the genius of a confederation. And remember, we called it a confederation in Canada. We are not a federation, we are a confederation. We believe in provinces having certain areas of jurisdiction and the federal government having certain areas of jurisdiction that are unique to both. And the reason you do that is so that people can look from one province to another and see what programs work there, what programs don't work. And as I found out, as I said, as a young teenager, a taxation program forcing families that wanted to get ahead to leave the province and go to other provinces to improve their lives. And people say, well, that just leads to a race to the bottom and all this type of thing. No, it leads to a race to efficiency and a race to better systems. So yeah, we were able to compare a lot. We were able to see what was working and what wasn't working, and other provinces were able to benefit from some of the things that we found out the hard way.
And some of your ideas came from populist roots, but at times it's a thin line between populism and just far-fetched pie in the sky ideas from people who have real no competence. How did you filter ideas from your grassroots up into the cabinet? And how did you balance the populist theme of the cabinet with good, legitimate ideas and policies?
Well, I think Ralph anticipated that happening. This whole thing of once you get elected, you wind up just speaking on behalf of the government, not the constituents. So he did something that's brilliant that I would recommend to all governments to do, especially at the provincial level. before, where you had cabinet ministers would come to caucus and they would say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And they run a program. And cabinet ministers are surrounded all the time by, well-meaning bureaucrats and interest groups. And they're hearing from them often more than they're hearing from their constituents. And there would be a tendency for power from on high, which is really a culturally Marxist principle that a few elites should control everybody else. Ralph flipped that on its head. He said to us as cabinet ministers, if you've got a proposal that you want to bring, you're going to have to bring it to what he called a standing policy committee, and those standing policy committees were all chaired by MLAs who were not cabinet ministers, and the co-chair or the vice chair of those committees was the cabinet minister. So the cabinet minister, you had to go to those policy committees of MLAs. And you had to get your ideas through them. You had to get it past them before you were even allowed to bring it to cabinet. So it was pushing back on that tendency that all power comes from on high and all the wisdom comes from the top elites. It doesn't. And we worked on programs, and still to this day, I train and advise newly elected MLAs on the fact that you need to be door knocking year round, not just at election time. And you need to be going to people's door and not shoving some government program at them, but saying, how do you like us so far? What are we doing that you like? What are you doing that you don't like? Because if you don't do that, you find out you're listening more to mainstream media. You stand terrified of criticism from mainstream media. You hear more from the institutions and the academics who are largely cultural Marxist in their thinking. And you need to continue to make sure you're hearing from the people who sent you and the people, the academics like to call that populism. I asked an academic, what is populism one time? I wasn't sure. And they said, well, that's when you're doing what people want. And I kind of scratched my head and I said, isn't that the essence of democracy?
Uh-huh.
Trying to do what people want? So, going to the people constantly, making sure you're doing that is really key to that. Ralph insisted on that, actually, as did, for a while anyway, other premiers, and that's where you really get to the roots of what's going to work and what's not going to work. Because if it's not working at home, if it's not working in your constituency, if it's not working in local families and business, then why do you think it's going to work at a level being promoted by the elites?
And so by the early 2000s, you'd had a lot of experience in senior roles in the Alberta cabinet, but you made the decision to go into federal politics. But before that, did you consider running for Alberta leadership to become Alberta premier? Did you ever think about that?
Well, I get asked that sometimes. Yeah, people were asking me to think about doing it, but I kind of thought Ralph's going to be here forever, and which I thought would be good. And I've never been a follower of unfortunately the type of politics you see in conservative parties where people are always out to hope the leader trips up and hope you can wind up or help the leader trip up and take them out and advance your own choices. So I actually felt Ralph or somebody like him would be there for a long time. And the thing that was driving us really to distraction federally was the fact that we had the Reform Party of Alberta, Reform Party of Canada, sorry, and the federal Conservatives, and they were constantly splitting the vote. And there was good reason for the Reform Party, and there was things that people were upset with. I understand that. But one election after another, they continued to split the vote. So there began to be a movement from within both those parties. Myself, from within the Conservative Party, I never was a member of the Reform Party, though I respected a lot of their concerns. And their Conservative Party thinkers and the Reform Party thinkers said, look, are we big enough? Are we, in terms of our own hopes for the country, that we're willing to set aside our egos and form one party? And that's what got the Canadian Alliance going. And so the Reform Party under Preston Manning's leadership did the right thing, and they folded up. A lot of the federal Conservatives came our way, but Joe Clark, at the time leader of the Conservative Party federally, was very stubborn and is actually a pretty strong small L liberal himself on most of these policies. A nice guy, but very, very socially, not just socially, but even fiscally conservative and even, liberal and left leaning. And so we went into the election with myself. I won the leadership race of the Canadian Alliance. There was 5 people running. And Jean Chrétien rightly saw it was a smart thing to do to call the election while we were still pretty disorganized. which he did. We still, at the end of the election, we increased the number of seats. We increased the number of voters, brought a million new voters. We increased to set record levels of fundraising, but we didn't quite get the job done. And the mainstream media always favoring the Liberals also helped. And also myself as a rookie leader, you never make all the right steps. You misstep from time to time. So it was a turbulent time, but we did increase. But that still causes, as conservatives, small c conservatives, we're very individualistic. We don't think collectively like the liberals, who are really socialists now, and the socialists. And so we're quick to, new leader comes in and maybe doesn't get the job done as quickly as we'd like. We're quick to look at replacing. And I didn't want to be trapped by that thinking at the provincial level. That's why I wasn't one of a group wanting to toss Ralph out of there. But rather, we chose to go. I chose to take these things that we had learned that worked to the federal level where they were desperately needed. That's what I did. A couple of years after the election, then there was another, quite rightly, another leadership race, which I called actually for the Canadian Alliance. Stephen Harper run that again. There were five of us who entered that race. I came second. People said, "Hey, you did well. You came second." I said, like Gretzky, when Canada won the silver medal one year at the Olympics and not the gold, he got congratulated for winning the silver. He said, "No, I didn't win the silver. I lost the gold. We lost the gold." So, but Stephen Harper won and did a great job then continuing the momentum. He pulled the two parties together, got the progressive conservatives to drop that ridiculous progressive word, which only leads to higher taxes and stranger policies, and went into the election. Then it was called by Paul Martin. Paul Martin, as a Liberal, still won, but the effect of us joining the parties was there, and we did better in that election. And then the next election after that, we still didn't get the majority, but Stephen Harper, who had been very effective as opposition leader, and we got a minority situation. And on it went until Stephen Harper eventually won a majority in 2011. And it was at that point I sort of said, and my wife and I looked at each other. I kind of said, "My work here is done," and we moved into the private sector. But that was the basic trajectory, and being able to take some of those lessons we'd learned at the provincial level and see them applied federally was very satisfying and gratifying.
When you look back on things, do you think if John Chrétien had not called that snap election in 2000, the Canadian Alliance Party would have had a better chance, or was there too many things going on? It's impossible to know.
Oh no, I think he was very smart in doing that because anytime people, especially at the federal level, if they're unsure, they're always going to go with what gives them more assurance. So voting Liberal was still felt like putting on the old pair of shoes that just seemed to work, and people weren't ready to put on the new runner. So he was smart, calling that quickly. He had mainstream media very much on side, so it was uphill battle all the way. We faced headwinds. Um, Again, we still increased, we still improved, but no, that was a smart call on his part.
And so through those years, you ended up meeting Prime Minister Harper. You guys ended up working together really well, and it went well. But do you remember when you met Prime Minister Harper and were you thinking that this individual may end up Prime Minister? Do you remember those days?
Yeah, I remember the first time I met him, he came out actually to, I was doing an event somewhere, and he came out, just wanted to meet. And I realized at the time, he was sort of casing things out. He knew that things were not going fantastic, and knew that, sooner or later I'd probably be in the position of calling another leadership race. So I can remember the first time, and I remember thinking, yeah, that guy's kind of sizing it up. And naturally, I ran again and ran against him, thinking that we could win. So you do that. But the other lesson I learned is after you have a race, a political race, especially for leadership, you've got to show that you're serious about the principles that you're running on, not the not the personalities. And I made it very clear to all of our supporters at the time, look, we are going to support whoever wins. Stephen Harper won, and I said to all of our team, "There's no mutinies here. There's no backknifing, no backstabbing. I know you're sad. You wanted to win, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to put up with any of that. We've got a country to try and govern. We've got a future election to win." And I think conservatives need to be more cognizant of that and not be so quick to dump the leader when the leader, according to the media, isn't doing that well. And so I said that very early on to Stephen. Is that I said, look, here to do whatever you want me to do. We're going to get this job done. And I had confidence in him as a leader. He turned out to be a great leader, as all of us thought he would be. And it was very satisfying to win elections under him, and actually to see him eventually win that majority election in 2011.
And so through the 2000s, you held a number of senior cabinet positions, including Minister of Public Safety, Minister of International Trade, President of the Treasury Board. But we kind of talked about this the first time we talked. Did you have a favorite position through those years?
I enjoy them all, enjoy the challenges that Stephen Harper asked me to take on. I really did enjoy public safety, because people who work in public safety, and I know there can be all kinds of criticisms and nobody's perfect and all that, but these are largely people who believe that our country should be safe, and they're willing to stand up and be among the people who keep a country safe. So, largely speaking, pretty committed group of people. And these are your people like the RCMP. This is the front lines of the borders of your prison system. Had the opportunity to go to Afghanistan a couple times and be with our troops there, and some of our police forces who were training Afghan police at the time. And I really enjoyed working with those folks. I was surprised to learn when I got in there that throughout Canada's history, the Liberals had never let our border officers have firearms. They had this notion that there's no crime in Canada, and we were in a situation where if there a dangerous individual was approaching the border, and we got notified of that by our friends on the south of the border officers would have to leave their post. They would have to desert the line and call for the RCMP to hopefully pick up those dangerous people who were coming in. And so, listening to people at the front lines and looking how we could do a better job was something that we were committed to. I got to meet a lot of different foreign leaders at the time. Even, it would surprise some people, but in areas of security and terrorism, meeting and dealing with the Saudis on where we could agree on terrorist policies. Within the Islamist community, the extremist communities, there are large groups who are terrorists, who even want to do damage to existing Muslim countries. Meeting President Putin, um, meeting individuals, there are shared concerns, telling our own people we've got to be spending more time looking at Israeli technology when it comes to drones. And I knew early on they were developing a dome system to protect from missiles. So, yeah, great opportunity meeting with people on areas of mutual concern like safety and security.
And at some point during that time, you ended up on a bike ride with President George W. Bush. For the listener, how did that story originate, and what was the policy outcome from that? Great.
Well, that was a fun development. We held a meeting under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and it was held in Montebello, Quebec. And we were meeting with our counterparts, principally at that time in the U.S., and it was to talk about things like border policy and terrorism-related items. At the time, along with that, there was a real concern because the Americans wanted to bring in, because of their own terrorism concern, they wanted to almost overnight bring in a policy that was going to really affect us at the borders, and we wanted a 6-month delay on it. It was to do with passport implementation, and we were trying to get the attention of the federal government in the U.S., saying, look, if we bring this in right now, it's going to be devastating to our border communities. It's going to be very tough on business. We don't have time to adapt. We wanted a 6-month delay. We weren't getting it. After we had our meeting with Prime Minister Harper and President George Bush, W. Bush, and he brought in his head of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff at the time, the secretary. Then President Bush said to me at the end of the meeting, hey, I hear y'all like running and doing stuff like that. Do you want to go on a bike ride? Because we were having the meeting up in the forest there in Quebec, a beautiful setting. And I remember going out of that meeting and saying to my chief of staff, look, the president's just asked me to go on a bike ride with him. I don't care if we have to get a bike from one of those protesters out there. I need a bike. So we got a bike. I went on the ride with him, and we were, wheeling all through the forests. And it was on that bike ride with a bunch of, um, Secret Service guys behind me on bikes who all looked like they could be in the Olympics. But it was there that, President Bush said to me, explain that thing about your delay that you want. And so for a half hour, as we're biking up and down all these trails, I explained it to him. We finished the ride. We took pictures and things like that. And as I was walking away, he called out to me and he said, "Hey, Minister Day." And I said, "Yes, Mr. President." He said, "You're going to get your delay." So I realized it's not always at a boardroom that you can make headway on things. You can, we called it mountain bike diplomacy, and we got our delay. So, there was different ways that you can have inroads and make gains with people when you have something that can be mutually beneficial.
How much of international policymaking, decision making gets made on mountain bike diplomacy? When you look back on things, is there more that goes on in that than you realize?
Maybe more than you realize, maybe more that you could, but there is a time where leaders, it could be whether it's leaders at cabinet or national or international leaders, they need to be just one on one. They need to be there without the bureaucrats. As much as you can from time to time, and if nothing else, to see and find out if you really do have some areas of common concern. So developing relations at a personal level is really important at the elected level, especially when you're dealing with international diplomacy.
There's a really important role for the media and democracy and making decisions. But I remember reading about some of the early presidents. I think it was FDR and maybe Teddy Roosevelt. They would just literally make decisions one on one with leaders without any involvement at all. Do you think there's a balance there, like you mentioned, where it's effective to make decisions and have conversations one on one, and that's sometimes what it takes?
Yeah, it can be the tipping point for sure. To get along one on one, you really get a chance to at least try and determine if the person's being sincere and if there's a common, not just a common good, but a common goal that can be achieved without being interrupted by even well-meaning bureaucrats or other politicians. And if from time to time you strike that chord, and sometimes it's a chord that can't be struck without doing the one-on-one. So yeah, those times are really important. You get to really sense, at least to a degree, the heart of a person, and if this is really going to be beneficial to all people concerned.
So fast forward to the 2000s, you ultimately ended up leaving federal politics, but how come you decided to leave federal politics and what led to that decision?
I'd always said, my wife and I had always said, if we ever get to the point that our hearts are into it, and I would even say to her, we get to the point where, it's going to be rough and tumble. There's going to be a lot of media grief and attacks. There'll be times when things go right. There'll be times when things don't go right. Times when I make the right decision, times when I don't make the right decisions, and I've sure done that. But we need to know that there's a buoyancy of heart, I used to call it, between the two of us. And it was coming up to those 2000 elections that I remember saying to my wife, we're coming up again. Looks like we could get the majority. We're all working hard for it. Are you ready to go again? And she just kind of said, if you want, you go ahead. But I don't have that same buoyancy of heart. And that was the signal I needed. And plus, I felt like it'd been around a bit already, 11 years at the federal level, 14 at the provincial level. And I never really did believe in career politicians. I can remember, getting in touch with the prime minister right away and just saying, you know, um, you can announce it whenever you like. I want to know I'm going to be there with you going into the election. I'll do whatever we can, and I think we're going to get the majority, but not going to present again to run. And that's basically how it unfolded.
And so at the time, what were you thinking? You'd go back to private life and sit on some boards? Were you thinking maybe you'd get back into politics eventually?
No, I thought I'd had a good run, and I'd felt like my constituencies had been good to me. Certainly, my wife had been good to me, and family. God had been good to me, and I just felt this has been a good run, and I could take some of the experience and apply it to the private sector, and that's what we've been doing.
And so, speaking of the private sector, the recent decision or some of the policy decisions coming from Ottawa, one of them being the Canada Alberta MOU, which I think you're skeptical of. But for the listener, why do you think the recent agreement has problems? And do you think there's potential there?
I don't like to be a skeptic. I like to be optimistic, but I kind of lean to that. The difference between a optimist and a pessimist is often the pessimist has more information. So I'm a bit pessimistic. I want to believe that Prime Minister Carney is correct that he really wants this stuff to go through, but I think he also knows it's going to be virtually impossible, certainly under his government, to get Premier Eby, the NDP socialist in BC, to allow these projects to go ahead. It's going to be virtually impossible to move Quebec off of what I see as a hypocritical position. They get all their, or a good portion of their electricity from hydro, still from Newfoundland and Labrador. And and yet, at the same time, they don't want a pipeline which could carry natural gas to Europe, for instance, which could break the stranglehold that Putin has on European countries. They're forced to buy his oil and gas. They're forced to fund his war against Ukraine while they fight against him. There's African countries in poverty that could so benefit from our refined products. And you have a province saying, no, Quebec, we're not going to let it happen, but they still have no problem with allowing Saudi oil to come in. So I think the prime minister is aware of those things and maybe aware that it's never going to pass, but it doesn't hurt him, certainly for Western Canada and Alberta votes, to say he'd like to see this go ahead. So I'm not overly optimistic, actually, under a Liberal federal leadership. I just don't think he's going to get the support he needs internally to see it go ahead. I don't think he's willing to stand up to some of the First Nations groups who don't want to see it go ahead. And these types of projects would hugely benefit the First Nations that are involved in terms of long-term jobs, long-term prosperity for their people. I don't think he's willing to stand up to some of the ones. The First Nations groups are just like any other group. Some are extremely left-leaning, very socialist. Some are communist, and some are more conservative-leaning. And he's not willing to stand up to the leftist drive among many of the First Nations groups. So I'm not overly optimistic for those reasons.
And the investor looking in at Canada might say to themselves that Canadian energy policy, in some cases, has effectively been left to the courts, where we're not sure where the decision's going to go. And as a result, we're not going to invest money into Canada. What do you think needs to be done to fix that perception? Is it just a clear rule book, or what would your suggestion be?
Well, you're quite right. Investors were already hearing it. They're just not going to be investing where there's uncertainty. And Canada's going to is being very much hurt by that. And I know the prime minister says, well, we're making great gains. We don't like the U.S. anymore, so we're making great gains with Mexico. But the Mexican government's very clear. Just sort of the last little while, they're putting out statements saying it's hard to do business in Canada. They're so regulated. They still have tariffs against us as Mexicans. And it's expensive doing business in Canada. That's the Mexicans saying that. While at the federal level, they're running around saying, oh, look, we're going to replace all this trade with the U.S. With Mexican, or drawing closer to China, which is a real mistake in terms of some of their policies. I'm concerned that we're going to see continued announcements at the federal Liberal level about new spending, but it's going to be spending with borrowed money, and inflation is going to continue to go up in Canada under those types of policies, and I am not excited about it.
Speaking of inflationary policies and getting projects built, one of which was the Trans Mountain project, which the federal government took on and ultimately completed at about $30 billion. Do you think that set a bad precedent for, even though the project got done, that's not the best way to make projects happen in Canada? And do you think it's better that those projects stay in private industry?
Well, yes, on a broad speaking, and I know some of the First Nations folks who were involved doing a very good job of convincing the government that that project needed to go ahead. But again, it's being used as an example. Liberals are using it as an example of what can happen, well, quite rightly. But the private sector uses as an example of how many years and billions upon billions of dollars due to the delays. So it's sort of a bittersweet one. It should have happened a lot sooner. It did finally happen. First Nations are going to benefit. But then the federal government and the socialists in BC are using that as an example. They're saying, "There you go. There's your project. We don't need any more." Yes, we do need more. China and Asia and India could so benefit from our refined products, and the government is saying no. Our natural gas, our refined products, going to places like India, which still has to survive. Millions of people surviving on literally burning cow dung and heating their homes on cow dung. China continuing to build coal-fired plants, when our natural gas, our oil and gas products, much better refined, could go to China, and the overall result would be a reduction in carbon emissions. But the left and the extremists on the environmental side, they just are absolutely fixed that that's not going to happen. They want to see us all returning to a dark age. And I'm very concerned again, under a Liberal government, I don't know that the moral will is there to really work hard and drive those policies through to the benefit not just of Canadians, but to even to other countries and to the benefit of the environment.
And from your experience, even from the Alberta days with Ralph Klein and your playbook there, of lowering taxes, keeping debt low, and basically just making good changes, what, if you were to look in at Canadian energy policy nowadays, would be your recommendations to make things better?
To go on what the science is saying, to show along the lines of what I'm just saying, that by allowing properly developed and properly refined oil and gas products to move ahead will be beneficial, hugely beneficial. We actually could be, if not the most prosperous country per capita of any in the world, one of the most. And so you've got to do the hard work and the hard policy work of convincing people. You've got to do that. You've got to go to the people in those provinces and be open and honest about it, not be afraid of getting media criticism. You really have to make the case. And I have found over the years that people, when they're fairly presented with fairly represented scientific and economic evidence, a majority will support you. 100%? No. And for people who are running for elected office, if they think they're going to get 100% of the environmental vote, no, you're not. But you can get enough of a percent by working hard, sharing and being honest and open with people about what you're going to do. You can get enough of those votes to convince people to get the policies in place that are going to benefit them overall and in the long run. It's tough work. It can be done, and it needs to be done.
And it's easy to be a pessimist, like you said, and throw rocks. In the case of the Special Projects Office, it's trying to help, it seems, but do you think another bureaucratic office is the solution to getting projects done in Canada? Or is that a
Well, again, I try and get the benefit of the doubt to Prime Minister Carney, but really introducing another layer on top of the existing layers to try and get through the pre-existing layers, it's not a recipe for success. I like the signal that it's sending, and hopefully to the technocrats down the line, that we really do want to get these projects through. I'm not liking the fact that another layer of bureaucracy has been added on. We'll give it time. I'm trying to give it support, but I'm not super enthusiastic about the possibilities there.
and it's easy to offer advice looking from the outside in at the federal Conservative Party nowadays, but without pointing fingers or passing the buck, what do you think the party could do better? And why has things not worked out the last, say, 10 years, based on your experience when you did have success with the party?
Well, conservative parties, when you track their history, generally they wind up falling apart even before they get to the starting line. And as I said, we as conservatives think individualistically more than collectively. So my advice, certainly to the federal conservatives, this is my advice to the provincial conservatives. You know, don't shoot the person who's leading when they make some missteps. And it doesn't mean you put up with somebody forever, but stick behind the leader. And you look at federally with not one day, not 1 hour, not 1 minute of positive media from the culturally Marxists towards the present leader Pierre Poilievre, who I know quite well, and he's a good person. He's got his head screwed on right, and he's going to do some good things. Don't dump the guy just because the media keep firing darts at him, and they're firing the darts at him because the media does not like small c conservative policy thinking. And stick with that person. Don't just throw them overboard, and give them a chance, to do what has to be done. And look at the polls. In spite of the onslaught, 24/7, never a break from mainstream media, the conservatives and the liberals are virtually neck and neck in the polls. And that's with the Marxist mainstream media, CBC and others, just fawning over Prime Minister Carney. I've rarely seen such a love affair. Well, there was a pretty big love affair with Justin Trudeau when he first came in, and it was going to change the marijuana laws and other things. There was a bit of a love in, But Prime Minister Carney, they will not question him on why does he want to move to $2.5 trillion in debt? Why doesn't he have a clear target on balancing the budget? The stuff they let him get away with, most of us just dream about having media like that. But in spite of that, it's virtually neck and neck in the polls, which shows people are listening. And I think people will continue to listen as long as the conservatives don't back off their policies. Nothing media likes more than to get a so-called conservatives in front of the camera on national TV and, silently and softly kind of shoot their own guy in the back. They'll start out, and you see them all the time. They call themselves conservatives, but they say, well, I like Pierre and he's a good person, but oh, he should have done this, he should have done that. And all that does is make people more and more think, yeah, we should be thinking a little more liberally. No, stick to the policies that are going to work, stick with that leader, be listening. There's times you got to refine things, but don't listen. Years ago, I had a first year in office, I had a very wise cabinet minister tell me every time the media barks doesn't mean you have to jump. And reach out to people, give people more credit than the media does. Keep singing that song, keep getting that message out there. Always look for ways to improve, but people will respond to common sense, whether it's on criminal justice policy or whether it's on immigration policy or fiscal policy. You will get enough of the vote eventually to win that election.
And having seen sectors like the energy business from inside government and outside government and from various roles, what do you think the biggest misconception that people have about the industry is nowadays and how it can be changed in its favor?
Well, again, the that particular industry, the energy industry, has always gotten a bad rap, and maybe way, way back before the regulations, some of it was deserved. But again, you've got a mainstream media that's completely controlled by extreme leftists. They don't want to see Canada develop financially. They do not want that. They want to see a few elitists in control. They want to see government being the only decider about who's going to be in business or not. So the energy business, despite the fact that, I was talking, I speak regularly in universities, talking to a university class, and these are all people, graduate level. They were going for their master's programs, either in business or in public administration. And I reminded them, as they all said, I remember there were 28 students in that class, bright, smart, young people in their mid 20s. And 25 of the 28, when I asked the question, what do you think we should be doing with the oil and gas, the fossil fuel industry? And they said, bury it all, leave it in the ground right now. And I said, do you realize that we would be crushed? Do you realize that the bikes you rode to school are built from natural gas products? You realize that your knapsacks, your pens, you realize the devices you're holding in your hands are made from products that come out of the ground. And there is a way which you really can develop sophisticated ways of developing energy that has and can lower emissions. So it's constantly getting that message out because the oil and gas industry, are they perfect? No. Are they getting a bad rap these days? Yes. And they're not getting a chance to make their case. And nobody's taking a really critical look at some of the alternatives in terms of are they successful or not. Wind technology doesn't really work in the Arctic, doesn't really work in northern Canada. Nobody's answered the question about what's happening to those giant windmills that have to be. They have a obsolescence problem. You do have to replace them, and the amount of time and the amount of mining that goes on first to make those giant windmills, then to take them apart eventually and to disassemble them and to see them reconstructed. Uh, Nobody's looking at the fact that EV cars, yes, they have their place and they have their opportunities, but in northern Canada and heavy loading and heavy trucks, there's times where they just don't work, and we got to start looking at that.
It's easy to be a pessimist, criticize all the problems in Canada and things that could be better, but what gives you optimism in Canada in terms of the economy or the country in general?
Well, just knowing that most people, not all, most people, when presented with the facts and when presented with respect They will follow policies that are going to be beneficial, first of all, to them, to their families, to their communities, and then their provinces or states or government. And just because of the fact I've seen it happen, that I've seen the fact that you can turn the tide. And one of the things that gives me hope is that the mainstream media increasingly is not the only arbiter and distributor of information. I do like the fact that there are alternative podcasts out there, that there are alternative media sources. It does require work on behalf of people to do the homework when you're looking. But the fact that uh, other points of view are beginning to get out there and other points of view on these issues, it's enough to start moving some of the people who've been captured, unfortunately, by culturally Marxist thinking. And as more and more people, it sounds a little glib, I guess you could say, but as more and more people, hear the truth can set you free. And we can have discussions that, even though we are not aligned all the time, people, I put a great deal of hope in people at the street level, I guess, the base level. The fact that and I've worked on policies together with in countries that might be, let's say, like with Israel, where you know we don't even on a religious point of view, we don't even agree like on who the Messiah is. The fact that I've been able to sit down with the Dalai Lama in northern India with his cabinet in exile and talk about the fact that we can help each other on a strategic item like how does Tibet deal with China? Unfortunately, a very sad story. And I can sit there as I did on a stage with the Dalai Lama and say, look, we don't agree on everything. I can remember saying to his group of monks and from some leaders from around the world saying, I believe Jesus Christ is Lord of the universe and the Dalai Lama doesn't, but we're sitting here side by side, arm in arm, and we're figuring out some problems that are going to benefit everybody. So that's where my optimism comes because I've seen once you get culturally Marxist academics and media off to the sideline and talk about these things, there is common cause that can be found, and you really can move together in a way that's going to be beneficial to most people.
And speaking of optimism, as Canada runs up record breaking deficits and seems to be headed in the wrong way fiscally, debts get bigger every year. And the other, in a strange sense, does it give you optimism that maybe real politics will eventually take their course and that the country will be on the verge of bankruptcy and will turn our tides around and that there is optimism in that direction? How do you think about that?
Well, it's an interesting point. It's well articulated there, and some people do say that. They say, "Well, we just need a round or two of socialism, and then people will smarten up." I heard that in British Columbia back before there was an NDP government, and it takes at least a generation, just financially alone, it takes at least a generation to recover from 4 years of socialist policy. So, I've got I've got some real concerns about that. It just takes too long to turn things around. The the fact that we have a prime minister who doesn't have a fixed date to get rid of the debt and the deficit, the fact that we are increasing to spend borrowed money, that doesn't make me optimistic. It's a long haul and a long walk out of that miry clay. I think we can do it, but we've got to win an election to get there. And so, am I optimistic? I have to be because I don't like the alternative.
But you've had an interesting career regardless. So if you're to look back on things, what advice would you give to your 30-year-old self looking back on your career?
Listen to other people. Make sure the things you are proposing you've really thought through and that you really do have something you offer that is going to be better, and be willing to make changes, not just to get reelected, but if you think the changes are going to improve on what you're bringing to the table, then be willing to do that and listen to the people who got you there. That would be your family, that would be your constituents, if you're a person of faith. listen to God. And as I used to tell our own caucus from time to time, we got a big problem here. Those of you who are people of faith, pray. And even if you're not a person of faith, you need to pray because we got some big issues here. We can win if we stay focused.
And to wrap up the conversation today, what message would you leave to Canadians the January of 2026? What would you tell them?
I would say optimism, there's reason for optimism. If you're focused on, you're willing to speak up, go against the concern, and if you're willing to get criticized and being called names, all for the cause of putting the right policies in place, then we can we can make gains so we can get out of this present problem.
I really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for round two.
Thanks for good questions and great interview. Appreciate it.
And you probably had a better week than I did. I came down with a flu on Tuesday after we spoke. So
So
it's great to see you again.
good to see you again. Look forward to chatting maybe some other time and hope you get rid of the last of that flu.